Now, this, as you recall, was where we had left. This is the picture of the Ottoman Empire consisting of this land on the north, Black Sea, on the west, the Sea of Marmara, though the straits are occupied by mainly the British, but not exclusively. There were also French and, for a brief period, Italian occupiers as well. Greeks also cooperating with them. So these are occupation zones under the occupation of mainly the British forces. And mind you that you have to consider the fact that the British were involved in some kind of a warlike situation, not declare war, with the emerging Soviet Union at the time. And therefore they considered what was happening on the northern shores of the Black Sea as a potential threat for the British interests in the region and in the world in global terms, and they were helping the White Russians against the Red Russians at the time. Therefore, protecting those straits were strategically critical for the British as well. And they held on to them until the end of the War of Liberation, 1922. Now, this little area was left in the hands of the Ottomans, but the rest, Greek, Italian, French, Armenian regions, and then the south was divided up between the mandates of the British and the French, and therefore the Ottoman Empire was completely dismembered according to this treaty on the 10th of August, signed on the 10th of August, 1920. Now, this was one of the first treaties of the World War I or post-World War I that was repealed as a result of the War of Liberation. Therefore, there was a lot of resistance to it by the British, as the coalition that they had established with the French, Italians, and others, the victorious powers of the First World War, crumbled in this part of the world. As the nationalist forces organized slowly, first emerged as local resistance to occupation. In Anatolia, this is the Anatolian Peninsula, and Eastern Thrace. In both locations, those areas that were occupied began to receive resistance, locally organized. Some were even individual, irrational probably, reactions, showing some kinds of courageousness which brought upon being stupid, such as someone pulling out a gun, attacking the incoming, and parading Greek troops and firing at them to be killed at the spot by the incoming army. One single individual. Two groups of people who are forming certain bands, acting in some kind of a guerrilla warfare-like resistance in various locations, especially in the Aegean region here, and also in Thrace from time to time, also in parts of Istanbul. So by the time Mustafa Kemal in 1919, as one of the youngest and the brightest generals of the Ottoman army, was given this duty of making sure that the conditions of the Mudros Treaty, signed at the end of the war in 1918, be implemented in this part of the world throughout the Ottoman Empire, so that the army would abide by the conditions of the armistice, disband, let go of its weapons, turn them over, etc. Had left Istanbul on the 15th of May 1919 and went to Samsun and landed there 4 days ago. There had already been a lot of organized resistance at communal level occurring throughout the landmass of the Anatolian Peninsula and Eastern Thrace. Anyway, what he was able to do was to emerge as the leader of these sort of incoherent, disparate resistance organizations, which he called as bushfires, so to speak, and form a organized, centralized command to put all of them together into a regular army that would fight against the regular armed forces of the occupiers under the circumstances. Now, in the east, in this part of the country, in Erzurum, he met with General Kazım Karabekir, and he was already, the latter, was already in command of troops, and he could have therefore command these troops in a way that he deemed necessary under his command, and it looked as if he was not very closely following orders or coordinating with the Sultan's government in Istanbul at the time, which took Mustafa Kemal some time to discover. For by the time he reached there, it didn't look as if the end of summer 1919, he was following the commands, and therefore the Sultan was getting anxious about his doings, and he was eventually disbanded from the armed forces. And therefore, by the time he met Kazım Karabekir, he was not necessarily representing the government or the state or the army. So if Karabekir did not want to accept his leadership, his call for a national resistance would have gone into some kind of difficulty. But that didn't happen. Karabekir accepted him as the leader of this organization and gave him enormous support. And he was in a position to deliver this kind of support. So he built up these various connections into a network in two conferences held in Erzurum and Sivas, these two towns. And the British gave him the opportunity when they raided and stopped the Ottoman Royal Majlis, Royal Assembly, from working as a legislature. So the legislature of Istanbul was closed down by the British. They were able to catch whoever they could. Some fled all the way to Ankara and participated in the nationalist resistance. Those the British were able to capture were taken to the island of Malta for investigation and trial for the atrocities that they had committed during the First World War against the peoples of the Ottoman Empire and other war crimes. Now they were held there, and a certain prosecutor was assigned to them, and this prosecutor looked into their matter. However, the events of the time moved in a way that the British started to have more and more number of British officers and officials being captured by the nationalists, and it became possible for the British, and also plausible for the British authorities, to swap the hostages with these people they held in Malta. And during the investigations, the prosecution did not find crimes that were culpable and could be pressed charges very easily. So it looked as if they did not really have those that they could press charges against in large numbers, and they did not seem to have a very open and shut case at their disposal. So turning these people over to the Turkish nationalists would not be a big cost or defeat for the British government at the time. So no charges were pressed against these people, and they were sent back to Ankara, and in return for which they received some prisoners at the hands of the Turkish nationalists. And the British government's official policy ever since then has been following that point, that from time to time when the issues about the First World War, especially the Armenian claims, prop up, the British government usually declares that their position as of 1924 holds. That is, whatever happened had happened during the First World War, and it looked as if the investigation did not bring out any fruitful results. And that is where they are standing. And they're not going to push for anything more. However, during the war, the British espionage, under the leadership of some senior officials and also some very bright junior members, such as Arnold Toynbee, famous historian, worked on a blue book, which was a compilation of atrocities committed by the Ottomans during the war. The previous international treaties signed by the Ottomans also and by these various countries prior to the First World War had already created war crimes as a punishable offense. And therefore, the British had argued during the First World War that the Ottoman officials will be held responsible for the crimes that they will commit after the war. And therefore, from the perspective of international law, they seem to have a position that they could legally press on effectively. So, as a result of all these developments, it became clear that the evolution of events and the emergence of a nationalist resistance in Anatolia had created a new political picture, and international relations were changing. International law usually follows international relations and deeply influenced by it, as the events of today also indicate to you throughout the world. As we have seen that, law enforcement internationally is not that meticulous or effective, as we very well know. And therefore, under these circumstances, it looked as if the two sides tried to accept the developing realities. Now, the developing reality was that in the city of Ankara, by 1920, it was possible to establish a new legislature, a Grand National Assembly, which eventually became the Turkish Grand National Assembly, in lieu of, or in place of, the one that was closed down in Istanbul. Now that they only had the legislature and nothing else at their disposal, the Turkish nationalists amended the 1909 Constitution of the Ottoman Empire and created a new document called the 1921 Constitution, which emphasized the role of the Grand National Assembly as the ultimate fount of all political legitimacy under the circumstances. And therefore, the new legislature encapsulated all the institutions of the state and became identical with the state. But they didn't call this a legislative state, they called it a legislative government, Meclis Hükümeti in Turkish, and argued that there is the unison of powers in effect in the practice of Ankara government. It's not the separation of powers, but unison of powers. All of them are embedded in the legislature. So the Grand National Assembly now was the government and the state wrapped into one. Its committees were the ministries of the government and executive branches, but they are embedded in the legislature. Some committees were independence courts, as they were called, istiklal mahkemeleri. They were also embedded within the legislature. And of course, the legislature itself, involved in legislation, was also within the same political, cultural context. And therefore, all three branches of government were housed in the same building. And the members of the Grand National Assembly therefore served in one or two or more types of jobs at the same time. Now this is, of course, due to the extraordinary circumstances in which the war was going on. Now the Speaker of the Grand National Assembly, Başkan in Turkish, became in practice the head of state. And after some debate and deliberation, where there was genuine differences of opinions and clash of opinions, and genuine negotiations and deliberations within the Grand National Assembly of 1920-21, they elected Mustafa Kemal as their head of state by electing him as the Speaker of the Grand National Assembly. And as head of state, he became the head of command of the armed troops at the same time. So the army became connected legally to the Grand National Assembly. So the legislature now began to operate with an army under its command. And the army was held accountable to the legislature, again, in the genuine sense of the term. There was, if you go through the minutes of the first Grand National Assembly, you'll see that various MPs, members of the Grand National Assembly, the deputies, asked serious questions, nasty questions, criticized heavily the performance of the military under Mustafa Kemal's command through the war of occupation. And the first couple of years, 1920, 21, all the way until 1922, where the Greek army moved inwards and could only be stopped or ran out of gas around the Sakarya River, very close to Ankara. They even debated moving the capital to Kayseri, further south. There was also genuine debate about that. Many argue that they will not move. They didn't go to Ankara to live. They went there to die. If the Greek army is going to roll over them, they will stand their ground and they can be killed there. So the Grand National Assembly, after the debate, decided to stay there. They could hear the big guns roaring throughout the meetings in 1922. However, at Sakarya, there are two versions. After about 3 weeks of heavy fighting, where about a little more than 5,000 Turkish nationalist troops died, they were able to stop the Greek army. That's one version. Another version was that the Greeks had moved so far into the land without not that much proper road system supporting them, their logistics began to suffer dearly. And they began to run out of ammunition, and they could not control any further. And in a sense, what the Turkish command did under Mustafa Kemal was not too different from what Kutuzov did to Napoleon earlier. We did not have the example of Hitler attacking Russia then. It's an old Scythian tactic. On the shores of the Black Sea, Greeks established colonies, north, south, etc. Scythians were people who were nomadic. They lived on horse-pulled carriages. They didn't build houses. They didn't have cities. They lived 10,000, 20,000 of them as nomads on horse-drawn carriages. They will appear at an instance, attack the Greek colony, suddenly, ambush, plunder and pilfer them, capture goods, also in forms of bounty, as whatever they could find, people, women, men also, and then pull back into the vast expanses of what is today Russia with enormous speed. By the time Greeks were able to come together, form an army, and go after them, they would have a huge lead. Then they'll pull back. As they pull back, they will destroy everything on their path. No food or water would be left to the enemy. In a short while, the Greek army would come into enormous amount of duress, difficulty, and succumb under the circumstances. Then occasionally, not always, they'll come back and kill them off. This tactic of the Scythians was used by Kutuzov against Napoleon, who had a far superior army to the Russian army. So when he attacked Russia, Russians pulled back as they occasionally hit the French troops, raided them in ambushes, and then pulled back, poisoning the wells, burning the cereals. By winter, the French were decimated. They came all the way to Moscow, went onto the hilltop, looked down on the city, and then pulled back. One of the first graphs in history was made of this war, and it's a very interesting graph. It starts out with a huge beginning, and in the end, it ends something like this. This was the size of the French army in the beginning, and this was the size at the end. Hitler, having not studied the situation carefully, made the same mistake. Attack Russia, they pulled back, gave him the same medicine. Worked every time. This is exactly what the Turkish troops did. Engaged the Greek army twice, then pulled back. Third time, they ran out of gas, pulled out of Anatolian Peninsula. As they pulled out, of course, they did the same thing. Burned everything they could on this way out, completely. Left nothing behind. It was complete destruction. They poisoned the wells. They completely eradicated various towns. Major towns here, Salihli, for example, Manisa, Kasaba, 95% burnt down, completely destroyed, completely devoid of population. They killed whoever they could find as they were pulling out to make sure that the Turkish nationalists would not come back after them when they pulled out of Turkey proper. They pulled out of Izmir on the 9th of September and of Bursa 13th. A treaty was signed in Mudanya soon after between not the Greeks and the Turkish national forces, but the British commander of Istanbul and the British troops and the commander of the Western troops, İsmet İnönü. And that started the process of ending the occupation, this time with the British. It was a rather sensitive period, whether the British would be pulling out of Dardanelles and also Istanbul or not. There were attempts at sort of using force, not using force on both sides, but eventually they agreed upon this, and peace negotiations started afterwards. So, in stages, first, Eastern Front until 1920, then the French in 1921, then the Greeks in 1922, and then the Islamist movement afterwards. Started out in 1924 with the abolishing of the Caliphate. Actually, the Caliphate is an interesting institution. Ottoman Sultan Selim I, or Selim the Grim, Yavuz Sultan Selim as he is known, conquered Egypt. And with conquering Egypt, it is alleged that he got the title of the guardian of the relics of Islam. The title was the relics, basically, Haram al-Sharifain. Not necessarily the Caliphate itself, perhaps. Selim did not use the title, Caliph. Suleiman the Magnificent didn't. Now, some historians argue that it wasn't until the 17th century, when the Ottomans were beginning to lose power, that the sultans did not lose this title, Caliph. Only after that, when they were losing power and losing legitimacy, they started to use Caliph and try to create an additional power of religion to uphold their claim to rule the Ottoman Empire and use religion as a legitimizing force, and Caliphate became part of that. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly, in a resolution, argued that it is the nation of Turks who rule, and the Grand National Assembly represents the will of that nation. There cannot be two rulers, two contradicting legitimacies. And therefore, since it's the people who rule, there is no room for the dynasty of the Ottomans to rule on the basis of any other principle. They're null and void. The end of the Ottomans. Simple resolution of the Grand National Assembly. Meclis kararı. But the institution of the Caliph was left behind until the beginning of March 1924. In the war, the Sultan had employed religion and had coalesced with the Islamist movement to oust the nationalists. There were 19 major incidents in which they were challenged effectively by the Islamist forces. They are known as uprisings against the nationalists occurring around Ankara. And as a result of that, the nationalists had great consternation, doubt, and no confidence in any Islamist institution, including the Caliphate. That the Caliph would eventually emerge as a political power, challenging the power of the new government, and emerging as a major political force in the new Republican era as well. And the Caliph started to ask for more funds for its activities and tried to increase its own institutional characteristic as astutely as possible. Now, under those circumstances, the nationalist government decided to abolish the Caliphate. There were some reactions to it, some major arguments against it. The Grand National Assembly decided that in spirit, the caliphate belongs to the Grand National Assembly. And it does not need a person, therefore symbolizing and signifying the institution of the caliphate, and therefore had it abolished. Now that was the beginning, but then a number of other steps were taken to roll back the power of the Islamists. And all of them had to do with major symbols of society, which had been manipulated by the previous modernizers as well. Mahmud II, for example, as I had told you earlier, had taken out turban and introduced the fez. This time the fez was taken out in early 1925 in a speech Atatürk made in Kastamonu, and introduced the hat. Actually, the same kind of reactions that were made against the fez 100 years ago in 1820s was now made in 1920s against the hat. People would not be wearing the hat. A new law defining the clothing of the male members of the society. No mention of females. And until 2008, no court decided on this matter to indicate it that the women's clothing were also legislated by the Grand National Assembly. But in a 2008 Constitutional Court decision, Constitutional Court argued that donning the turban, the headwear, in a certain style is a violation of that law. And that decision still stands. Nobody abides by it. For Turkey, it's not a rule of law. That's a different matter. Yes?
I'm a little bit confused. You told that the caliphate was abolished and the Grand National Assembly wanted to include it in their system, so that they...
Not included in the system. It says it spiritually exists in us, they said.
So it's,
not effectively.
So it's still existing somehow, and okay. And
it may or may not, depending on how you wish to interpret it. Nobody will buy this argument today in Turkey. I'm sure not even the current Grand National Assembly. Nobody will buy it in the larger Islamic world. The claim to caliphate was never accepted by the Iranians or the Shiites in general. Anyway, it was a claim about the Ottomans within the Ottoman land only after the 17th century, 1 century after, so to speak, this title was taken on by Selim the Grim, if the argument is correct. They then started to use it in their official declarations. In the Ferman, the charters that they had written, they start to allude to their titles as the caliph from then on. And as the empire came under increasing difficulty, the more they tried to use religiosity. And of course, it climaxed during Abdülhamit II's reign, when he thought that he could use the power of the Muslims living under the British rule in India and also under the Russian rule as Russia expanded after 1860s into Central Asia, and these two empires began to host huge numbers of Muslim population and began as major empires with Muslim populations under their colonial control. So Abdülhamit II calculated that if he comes up with this title of caliph and plays it up and emerges as a religious leader, he may call on to them to rise up against the British in India and also the Russians in Central Asia. If they come to attack Ottoman Empire again, that they could be effectively used against these colonial powers in some way. We had the First World War, nothing of the sort happened, as you very well know. So this facility, let's say, could not be used effectively.
You were also saying that the two governments were existent at the same
Yes.
time. So, but how could Ankara just tell, yeah, okay, now the caliphate is abolished? Because they were like,
They first
the Sultan would say, yeah, I
no, they first abolished the Istanbul government in November 1922.
But Ankara abolished the
Exactly.
And how could they do it? They just
Because they had the power.
absolutely.
And the Sultan had already fled on a British battleship at the end of the war. So
Could just say
it was by October, Istanbul was in the hands of the nationalists, and the Sultan had already fled. Some member of the dynasty stayed on to function as Abdülmecit II as the caliph. So the political power of Istanbul was abolished by November, by which time the nationalists had won the war and had eliminated them. And on the grounds that they represent the nation and the Sultan represents the tradition, traditions are gone. Too bad. They lost the political struggle, and as a result of which the basis of the new regime now was national sovereignty and the will of the nation as it is symbolized in the Grand National Assembly and its government. So they were able to abolish the Sultanate first, then the Caliphate, and then started to get rid of the symbols of traditionalism one by one. Only the religious officials, while they were carrying out religious duties, prayer, khutbah, was, that is, sermons and interpretations and explanations after the prayer, and also in funeral processions they can wear the religious garb. Otherwise, wearing the religious garb is illegal according to the new law. Is it heeded effectively? Not so much. There have always been those who tried to challenge that. In the past, police and authorities had prosecuted these people. Prosecution against them is now dropping dramatically for the last 30 years. Not with this current government. Don't get the wrong impression. That practice started with the military government of 1983. Continued with the Motherland Party government of Turgut Özal. Then died down a little bit in the 1990s. Then flared up again under the current conservative government once again. So, abiding by the law is not meticulously followed, or, for that matter, meticulously enforced by the political authorities in Turkey. As a result of which, you can see considerable amount of variation on that ground. Now, women's clothing were not considered as central to this argument, and in a sense, women were not dealt with and left alone. Now, you should take into consideration at this point that this society that was left behind after this war and had become sort of a new nation state with a changing, of course, cartographic image, and this is the current cartographic image. This part was added on after 1938, officially in 1939. Never accepted by Syria, but the treaty was legal, so the legality is not in any question. It is now going through a very tough period. The province of Hatay, former province of Alexandretta. It's the ancient Antioch. So, if you're interested in such things as the emergence of Christianity, that's where Christianity emerged. You can go and find the cave church of St. Paul, for example, in that region now. And it was Paul and Peter who propagated the ideas more than Christ himself, and therefore Antioch played an enormously important role in the development of all of this, and therefore this is a very interesting place. And this is one area which the Crusaders wanted to conquer. They did, establish their stranglehold and lived there for a long period of time until they were defeated by the Arab armies eventually, and they became part of the picture. Now, this was added on in 1938-39, and this border was negotiated between the Turkish Republic and the League of Nations, to which Turkish Republic was not a member, and to the south of it is the British Mandate of Iraq. And this border was established temporarily by the Commission, headed by a Norwegian gentleman at the time. So Norwegians had this habit of sort of conflict resolution for a long, long while. Didn't come up all of a sudden after they became the oil kingdom of the north, or sheikhdom of the north, however you may want to put it, became filthy rich because of that. They were considered as relatively fair referees in this matter. They established this border, and this border was recognized by Turkey in 1926, 1 year after, a little less than perhaps, a major rebellion that took place in the province of Genç, which is now part of Bingöl today, not too far away from there, where the Turkish government saw some kind of British espionage taking place in that area, and they thought that continuing down this line would be perilous for the Turkish Republic, as young as it is, as frail as it is under the circumstances. So they settled this border in 1926. So this border and the border with Syria were not settled in the Treaty of Lausanne, signed on the 24th of July 1923, but afterwards. They were left behind. The rest was settled then, all of these borders. The border with Armenia was, so far as the Turkish side is concerned, was settled in 1920-21 through 3 treaties, which I've already told you about. The one signed in Gümrü in December 1920, then in Moscow, March, and then the following fall of 1921 in Kars. These 3 treaties established the border between the 2 countries. Armenia is challenging the border, but that border is internationally recognized as far as the international law goes. The border with Georgia, again, is internationally recognized, although qualms about it started in 1945, and that's one of the main reasons why Turkey decided to become a NATO member, to protect itself against Russian or Soviet encroachment on Turkey. Stalin, born in Georgia, argued that parts of Georgia, these parts of Turkey, are parts of Georgia, should be reunited with Georgia. 1945. It was, again, a tough challenge, had to be responded, but no such challenges seem to be occurring between Turkey and Georgia now. They have more to worry about because of their relations with Russia, rather than with Turkey for the time being. And therefore, the borders became established by Treaty of Lausanne in 1924, and the Treaty of Sèvres was repealed. So the 2 cartographies give clear images of what Ottoman Empire would have been like had they lived under the Sèvres, and what Turkish Republic is when you compare the 2 maps. The first one leaves a little bit of area around here as the Ottoman Empire, whereas now the Turkish Republic is this land, and which was established after a war of liberation, started out with a declaration, one of the last declarations of the Royal Assembly of the Ottoman Empire, of a national pact for a national homeland for Turks, Misak-ı Milli. And most of those borders are now materialized. We have been looking at this image for the last week or so of the Treaty of Sèvres, which was repealed by the War of Liberation, and the new cartographic image of Turkey was created, as I had tried to show to you in this map, where, except for these two borders to the south, one with Syria and the other with Iraq, the borders of the country was negotiated at the Treaty of Lausanne, and the western border corresponded with the Maritsa River, with Bulgaria and Greece, which divided the Thracian Peninsula, this is the Thracian Peninsula, into two, Western and Eastern Thrace. Muslims residing in Western Thrace were left in a special status within Greece. The east of the border became legitimately part of Turkey, and there were certain disputes over the course of the river and the border between Turkey and Bulgaria, which were settled in the 1990s. Eventually, by the two sides agreeing on the status of the border, because it's a river system, it keeps changing its course and flows in different directions. Therefore, the border seems to shift as a result of that. So the two countries developed an understanding as to how the emerging land in the form of islands and whatever in the middle of the river are going to be settled, and it was settled in the 1990s. And it's all over with. As I told you, the borders in the east were negotiated with the Soviet Union before the Treaty of Lausanne, and therefore by 1923 they became more or less established on both sides. Issues emerged about them in 1945 after the Second World War, when Stalin started to press Turkey for some kind of alterations in the borders between Turkey and Georgia, but those alterations never happened, which was one of the reasons why Turkey decided to move closer to NATO and become a NATO member by 1952, officially accepted in 1951. And the border between Turkey and Georgia is now pretty much stable. And if you would like to go to the tip of Turkey on the northeast, Artvin, now you fly to Batum, or Batumi in Georgian, which is on the other side of the border in Batum, without a passport, go through the airport there and come back into Turkey. So that shows you the status of relations between Turkey and Georgia today, quite amicable, and no major problems seem to occur. The southern borders with Iraq were established in 1926, finally, after it was negotiated through the League of Nations. A committee suggested a temporary border, which was not very easy to protect on the north. The border there goes over very high mountains, going up to 3,000 meters from the sea level, and also follows deep ravines, valleys, not very easy to monitor or protect. One main reason for that was that the British assumed that sooner or later the Turkish Republic would demand the province of Mosul on the north and Kirkuk, where there is ample oil resources, and will probably push south. The British tried to make a military operation as difficult as possible for the Turkish government, and therefore kept the border under those circumstances. And that has created a very big problem for Turkey, which still continues. That border is like a sieve, and it's not very easy to control that border. And it continues to be a problem with northern Iraq, especially after 1984, when a terror campaign against Turkey was launched by a Kurdish organization called Partiye Karkeren Kürdistan, PKK, and that border became a major problem. So, however, there are no legal issues about the border. Turkey accepted that settlement of the League of Nations, in spite of the fact that Turkey was not a member of the League of Nations, and Britain was. Therefore, it could pull many more levers than Turkey could. Turkey did not want to pursue any more hostilities between Britain and Turkey after 1925. For in 1925, a major uprising took place, as I told you last time we met, in the province of Genç, which became Bingöl over time, where a Naqshbandi sheikh with Kurdish credentials rose up against the state, and the Turkish government discovered that there was some kind of British complicity in all of this. And as a result of which, moved very fast to somehow create a stable legal border between Turkey and the British Mandate of Iraq. So by 1923, when the Turkish Republic was established, Turkey's neighbors were not Syria and Iraq, but French Mandate of Syria, therefore France, and British Mandate of Iraq, therefore Britain, Soviet Union, and these Dodecanese islands had already been occupied by the Italians in 1911 through the Treaty of Ushi, and they kept those islands in their hands until the end of the Second World War. And therefore, on the southwest, Italians. Italian, French, British, Soviets. So those, by default, became the neighbors of Turkey. America was not playing a major role, the US, in the interwar period. All of the major powers of the world became, by default, neighbors of Turkey. And that, of course, created an environment for Turkey to be increasingly cautious in planning and executing foreign policy. And after Mussolini came to power in Italy, he started to rethink about the earlier Italian government's position in the War of Liberation in Turkey, and began to demand that the city of Antalya on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey in the south is actually an Italian city. And Mussolini wanted to annex that city and include it into these Dodecanese islands and move into Turkey. Therefore, Turkish government felt increasingly threatened by an Italian invasion from the south, and kept that area under military vigil for a long period of time. Not much development occurred in that area. Actually, roads were not built. No railroads connect to this area. It made sure that any landing of Italian troops would run into huge difficulty moving inland. For quite a bit of that area, which no longer is, was a marshland at the same time. So they were hoping that if the Italians had landed any troops, they'll be bogged down in the marshland and could be easily stopped by the Turkish military after 1920s. I'm telling you all of this just to give an idea of what the Republic more or less inherited in 1923, so far as its neighborhood is concerned. Also, as you can see on this map, there are many flares. I added some more, but I can't see them now. Add another flare in Syria, another Crimea, also in Ukraine, you will see that the country is also pretty much surrounded by all sorts of conflict areas. We have a severe conflict going on in Syria where there is a civil war. Another civil war is also unfolding in Iraq. And we have problems with the PKK to the south of the border. And we're trying to somehow, as Turkey, handle and manage the affairs of this region with some kind of negotiation that is going on with PKK. Then we have Iran, which does not seem to be embroiled any kind of conflict at the moment, but it doesn't have a peace treaty with Iraq. They were at war between 1980 and 88, and that war has an armistice. That's it. They stopped firing at each other. But this border is not recognized now by either side as the border of peace, negotiated and settled through peace. And therefore, there is a potential for further conflict, friction, tension, even war between the two. But especially Iraq is in no state of reconsidering any kind of heightened conflict with Iran at the moment. Then Azerbaijan has enormous amount of problems with Armenia and likewise, vice versa. Armenia with Azerbaijan, which has been going on since the late 1980s. And that issue of the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh region, or Dağlık Karabakh in Turkish, or Azerbaijani, which is under Armenian occupation, is still unsettled. It's one of those issues that OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, is still looking into, but no settlement seems to be occurring. And there's also a relatively large number of Russian troops stationed in Armenia, and they can easily come into that kind of conflict and bring it up into a larger and broader war of some sort. Then Georgia has had its difficulties with Russia. It has its various separatist movements, Ossets in the north, Abkhazians on the west. The only one that is settled is with the Ageria here. That has been settled recently with Turkish-Georgian cooperation, so not much seems to be flaming over there. But Crimea suddenly developed into a crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is in a mess, as you very well know now. Romania, Bulgaria are right, but Moldova is also engulfed in some kind of inner conflict with its Transdniester Republic. And also the Aegean, we have a serious problem between Turkey and Greece about the territorial waters and their span. And this has been continuing for a long while. The Dodecanese Islands were turned over to the Greeks after the war, the Second World War in 1945, mainly for their suffering in the hands of the Italians, but more so of the Germans during the German occupation of Greece. So Turkey accepted that transfer. There is no legal issue about the status of those islands. And one of them is right here in Antalya, which this map doesn't show. Mace, it's approximately less than half a kilometer from the Turkish shore, approximately about 600 miles away from Greece. And that, of course, is another potential cause for agitation if either government wants to sort of create tension over these islands. But there seems to be a lot of issues with those continuing. Now, this is one picture Turkey inherited that you'd like to consider. And these issues have been continuing for a long while to come. Now, not all of those conflicts are of Turkish making and directly relate to Turkey. Though Turkey has had various entanglements in all of these, and therefore they have a big impact on Turkey. Because of what's going on in the south, large groups of people are taking refuge in Turkey and settling in Turkey, some of them. And they are now some groups of people, several 100,000 who have been living in Turkey since 2011 for 3 years. And they are becoming less temporary, more permanent as part of Turkey under these circumstances. We have had similar gushes from other parts of the Middle East due to previous conflicts. In the 1990s, as Saddam's armies moved north, another 500,000 Kurds fled into Turkey again to take refuge here. So we have been receiving this. In 1989, Bulgarian communists decided to get rid of all those Muslim Turks. So Turkey suddenly received about 890,000 Turks arriving by whatever means they could find in Turkey. So we do have that kind of movement of population into Turkey. Turkey receives more migrants than exports migrants. So net migration into Turkey is positive. So more people come to settle in Turkey than those who leave and to go away Turkey. But those who leave Turkey is part of brain drain. Better educated people who seek better careers in other parts of the world. US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Oceania, whatever. Many leave. And in their place, we usually receive people who are taking refuge from some kind of tyranny from somewhere around the globe, who consider this as the heartland of their ancestors, and they come to this land to settle. And that has, of course, created a highly complex demographic picture of Turkey. And of course, because this was a leftover of an empire which had spanned over all this territory for a long period of time around Turkey, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, parts of the northern Black Sea, Caucasus, also Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, many come and settle in Turkey from all those lands. They married into the stock of people living in Anatolia and Eastern Thrace, and therefore we have a genetically highly complex population here. Who you consider to be Turks is usually anything but. Many have their ancestors coming from the Caucasus, Arab countries, some from the Sudan, as south as Sudan, Africa, some from Libya, Algeria, some from Russia, Central Asia, all the way to Manchuria or Xinjiang region of China, settling here, mixing, creating the population here as such. And many studies, especially recently, have discovered that there is no sort of racial composition which we can identify as being the dominant racial composition of this demographic picture. So ethnic Turkish nationalism, basing their arguments on race, seem to have a difficult problem of solving the genetic basis of this demography. We are a mix. So you can find all sorts of people. Blondes with blue eyes, green eyes, dark-colored people, African-looking people, Nordic-looking people. There has been all sorts of mixtures here. And that is one major result. And then, of course, there was the impact of the War of Liberation. Now, this is a demographic picture of what was left behind in this geography after the War of Liberation. I don't know how visible this is. It's a little poor quality. I'm not so sure those of you who are in the back can see this. But the columns on the left, multicolored ones, are the columns of the results of census in those provinces in 1912. At the beginning of the Balkan Wars, before the end of the Balkan Wars, and before the First World War, and the War of Liberation. The columns on the right are the results that the that were collected in 1922, after the Balkan Wars and the First World War and the War of Liberation. And that picture shows you that there was a huge destruction of the population pool in some parts of the country. One, for example, this was the number of people living in 1912, and this is what is left in 1922. The rest either fled or died. We don't know. But those people who had existed in 1912 were no longer in the population roster in 1922. They could not be found. Some fled with the Russians into the Caucasus. These figures were given by the Armenian representatives to Lausanne. They argued that about 250,000 Armenians living in the city of Van moved back into the Caucasus with the Russian troops after 1917. So some must have survived, but not all. Probably a huge majority of these were killed. On both sides of the population left, a small percentage happened to be Muslims. There were no Christians left. Now these figures do not indicate ethnicity. They indicate their millet identity, religious identity. So there is a Muslim, Greek, Armenian, Jewish number that we can find. Nothing else was recorded. And the fight in the East was between Muslims and Armenians. So it was a religious fight, not an ethnic fight per se, so far as the demographic pictures are concerned. But those Muslims who were involved in the process, especially the authorities, were moved by ideas of ethnic nationalism, Turkish ethnic nationalism to a certain extent. And that created the claim that this was a Turkish-Armenian kind of clash. Not on the ground, not so. It was a Muslim-Armenian matter, but since Ottoman Empire was involved in it, even the Arab Muslims didn't look at it from that perspective and doesn't look at it from that perspective even now. Again, from demographic perspective, we know that relatively few Turks lived in that area. More of them, ethnically speaking, were from other background, Arab, Kurd, but not necessarily Turkish per se. Probably some Turks also lived. But everywhere in the East, we see a big devastation. Again, 1912 in Erzurum, 1922 in Erzurum. That was a big drop in all of this, in all of the population. In the West also, as you can see, this was the population of Izmir in 1912, and this is what we had in 1922. All the Christians were gone from this area. Some of them died, many of them fled with the Greek forces. Similar picture in Bursa. This was the size of the population in 1912, and this is the size of the population in 1922. All of it Muslim. So there was a considerable amount of loss of Christian population. Of course, in 1922, again, by the intervention of the League of Nations, there was an exchange of population. About 2.5 million Greek Orthodox left Anatolia, moved to Greece on the other side of the Aegean. About 500,000 Muslim Greeks came to the east and settled in their places. There was a big population exchange. Now that 2.5 million who went from Turkey to Greece constituted about 50% of that population. But 500,000 Greek Muslims who came to settle in Anatolia constituted a very small percentage of the population in Turkey. Even today in Greece, about half the population comes from Anatolian backgrounds. As opposed to Turkey, those people who came from the islands, Aegean islands, and also Greek mainland proper and settled in Turkey, except for in Western Thrace, they were left there because of the Treaty of Lausanne. They are a small proportion of the population in Turkey, which has, of course, increased tremendously from about 13 million at the time to about 76 million now. Whereas the population of Greece increased from about 5 million at the time to about 10 million now. So not the same kind of populations we're talking about. Now, of the population left behind, there was considerable amount of devastation, which you should also take into consideration. Now, if I can find my slide here, I can show you some more statistics about the World War I devastation. Which this is a better picture of it. And this shows you the kind of population change that occurred between 1912 total. These are the 1912 totals. The whites are 1912 Muslims. And the third column is the 1922 Muslims. So the Muslim population also dropped, increased in Edirne. Total population dropped quite a bit. Most of them were part of the exchange. Izmit again. Ankara again. But you can again see in the east there was the biggest change in population, where the non-Muslims were pretty much gone. And look at the populations of one. This was the total in one, and this is what is left in one after the war. Huge population loss occurred in this period in time. Of all populations, more of it by the Christians, less of it by the Muslims as such. We can give you a better estimation here also by mortality figures, Muslim mortality figures as well. In the east, approximately 500,000 Muslims, 600,000 Armenians seem to have dropped out of the population rosters from this, according to this calculation. In the west, 1.2 million Muslims and 313,000 Greeks seem to have dropped out of the rosters within that 10-year period between 1912 and 1922. Now, Muslim mortality in the east seems to follow this pattern. One, about 62% missing. These are percent missing. We don't know whether they survived, fled, lived elsewhere, whether they were abducted, taken away by some army, Russian or Ottoman, or moved to another land, or died. But you can assume that all of them were killed. But this will be, there's no way of proving what happened to these people. But 62% of the Muslims living in one perished, disappeared. In Bitlis, 42,000, right? The province right next to it. These are all in eastern Turkey. Erzurum, 31%. Diyarbakir, 26%. Mamuret el-Aziz, that's the name of Elazığ today in Turkey, 16%. Sivas, 15%. Huge population losses. You add them up, come to close to about 2 million people. Out of a population of about 13 million people, 1 out of 6 seem to have died. This has created, of course, of these Muslims who died, a huge majority are men, able men, who can serve in the military. And therefore, who could also till the land, work in an agricultural economy as farmers. So Turkey had a huge depletion of labor resource at the end of the war, at the same time. And of course that has created a big problem for Turkey to fix. Two more problems harassed the Turkish population in 1920s, from 1923 onwards. One was malaria, large number of mosquitoes infecting and killing people, debilitating them. Even if they didn't die, they had a miserable life and they could not perform well under the circumstances. And that was considered as one of the major threats to the population, and the Turkish Ministry of Health, Education and Health declared the war on it, and which continued until the 1950s. Eventually in the 50s, Turkey won the war against the mosquito, more or less. There are very few left now. I don't think most of you are bitten by mosquitoes now, as far as I can tell. Another big problem, which continued for a little while longer, was tuberculosis. When I started elementary school, there's a sign everywhere, almost on every wall. Stay away from people who are coughing, the sign said. And we all paid attention to that. Even now, if somebody coughs near me in a bus, I try to change my position. It has left an indelible mark in my brain that people coughing, great danger. That was also taken care of. We don't have a major problem with tuberculosis any longer. And tuberculosis now is coming back, and there seems to be no effective medicine curing it now either. So we may see with the next generation of my grandchildren, so to speak, grappling with the same idea of how to position themselves in public places so that people coughing on them will not be a menace or a threat for their lives under those circumstances. So these basic characteristics of a depleted labor force, debilitated by tuberculosis, malaria, and malnourishment, in a land surrounded by big powers, some of them as their own territories, some as colonial powers, mandates of Britain and France, more or less determined the basic international strategic characteristics that have left a major indelible mark in the minds of those who ruled Turkey from very beginning onwards. First generation of leaders, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as the president and the leader of the Republican People's Party, and then İsmet İnönü and others, all were deeply impressed by all of these developments. Now, the political legacy of this period, separate from the political legacy of the Ottoman Empire, is number one, that the idea of national self-determination was developed and established as the pillar on which political legitimacy of the new regime rested in its fight against the occupying powers, also against the Sultan's government in Istanbul. So it was resisting both forces. It replaced the previous traditional patrimonial medieval basis of legitimacy, which was formulated as political sovereignty, hakimiyeti siyasiye in Turkish. Instead, it was now substituted by national sovereignty. Successfully, those who pushed for national sovereignty won the struggle domestically and internationally, and established the borders and established a homeland for the population living here as Turks. homeland became critical in defining the characteristic of this new nationalism. It was based on the homeland which was drawn up by the National Pact. In fact, they used the terminology developed by the Treaty of Mudros, the Armistice Treaty, imposed upon the Ottomans on the 30th of October 1918. Now, in the National Pact, the critical definition alludes to, gives a reference to the Mudros Treaty of Armistice of 30th of October 1918. 30 October 1918. Now, this is the Turkish terminology, which again I translated into English. I hope I've done a good job. Let me read the Turkish first for those of you who understand Turkish, so that you can check on my translation. 30 Ekim 1918 tarihli anlaşmanın çizdiği hudutlar dahilinde dinen, ırken ve emelen müttehit, müttehit ittihat demek, birlik. Emelen ambitionları dolayısıyla demek. Osmanlı İslam ekseriyetiyle meskun bulunan aksamın tamamı fiilen ve hükmen gayri kabili tecezzi bir küldür. Okay? You understand this? Okay, I'll translate it into English. Those areas within the borders drawn by the treaty signed on 30th of October 1918. So not only the Ottomans, not only the nationalists, but those who signed that treaty on the other side, the British, the French, the Italians, etc., should also accept, the argument goes, who are predominantly Muslim, of Ottoman extraction, are de facto and de jure, in fact and by law, united indivisibly through the solidarity of their religion, race, and shared ambitions. This is more or less the definition of a nation, shared ambition. The will to live together. That's how political science even today defines nationalism. Those communities of people who have the will to live together into the future and who share a past, which usually determines that will to live together, is the basis of defining a nation anyway. So by referring to this Armistice Treaty, they made their argument in the National Pact of 1920, at the very start of the War of Liberation, that they are seeking to salvage a national homeland for this population, majority of who happen to be Muslim Ottomans. Ekseriyeti Müslüman olan Osmanlı. That's the definition. This is the definition of the patriotic basis of national existence on a homeland, which they argue coincided with the borders of the Treaty of Armistice, which they could not protect, because those borders had included Mosul and north of Syria as well. For the Ottoman armies, when they signed the Treaty of Armistice on the 30th of October 1918, were still in possession of those lands, but they were pushed back by the Mandate powers, and the picture changed and they accepted it. Now the political legitimacy, therefore, of the new regime emanated from will of the nation. It's a concept that Turkish politicians still use today. They call it milli irade. It does not have much reference in especially Europe or elsewhere. This is a jargon not used anywhere else, very much so, but still alive in Turkey about 80, 90 years after the War of Liberation, and it is used by all colors of politicians. Even those who seem to have some kind of entanglement with the Islamist movement still use the term national will and arguing that they represent the national will. Of course, that is not true. For the national will is represented in the institution of the legislature. So the Grand National Assembly, the whole of it, the government and the opposition, all elected members of the Grand National Assembly collectively represent the national will. So a president cannot represent the national will, for example, especially one who is elected, because he gets the vote from a certain percentage of the people who participate in the elections. We had one such exercise on the 10th of August 2014. The winning candidate got 20,670,000 votes, according to the Election Commission. 20,670,000. The total number of registered eligible voters in Turkey were 55 million. That corresponds to only 37% of the people. So 37% of the people voted for this winning candidate. He represents them, there is no question about that. What about the rest? We don't know. The rest are not represented in him. Perhaps there are some who believe that he is the greatest menace that has ever come to serve Turkey. He is the greatest threat to humanity on earth. They perhaps hate him, abhor him, believe that he is the worst kind of candidate to win. We don't know. They did not vote for him. But that is not true for the Grand National Assembly. Those who didn't vote for the winning candidates in the Grand National Assembly voted for the opposition. So the current Grand National Assembly in 2011 got the support of 95% of all the voters who voted in that election, which corresponds approximately to 80% of people living in Turkey. The other 20% don't care one way or the other what happens at the end of the elections anyway. They're apathetic. They're inactive. Remember one of the first lectures when I taught you about power? So power relations is built on authority, manipulation, and inaction. Creating passive, inactive people is the gist of ruling properly in a political system. You can assume that they are satisfied with whatever they have, and they don't care about politics at all. And under those circumstances, rule becomes relatively easy to manage under those circumstances. We have about 20% or so of the population in that category in this country. They do not vote in elections. Usually about 80% do. So when you get 95% of the 80% of the people or so who voted, but actually in 2011 about 84% participates, about 80% of the people are represented one way or the other in the Grand National Assembly. Then you can call the Grand National Assembly as the symbol, structure, spirit of the national will, perhaps. The whole of it. Not the majority, not the minority, not anybody. 550 members of the Grand National Assembly representing the people. That's the basic idea. And that is the national will, which is against occupation, fighting the enemy. This is sort of a jargon you would use in the War of Liberation. Fighting an enemy. So it has to be used with sensitivity. When you employ this jargon and argue that the government is the will of the people, so who is the opposition? It automatically delegitimizes the opposition in the minds not only of the government, but those who supported the government. Therefore, opposition becomes an enemy. Well, then you can't play a democratic game very easily, because democracy is not a fight between the enemy and the people. It's a competition for the hearts, minds, interests of a group of people. Some come to serve for a while the interests of those people by their support. If people believe that their interests are better served by someone else, then they switch their votes. When they switch their votes, they're not traitors. They can't be considered as selling out the good people. You know, this is impossible. So there are different roads, visions to the welfare of the people, represented by different ideologies, different interests, different parties, different teams, and people make selection between them. It's a contest, not a war. So under these circumstances, in the War of Liberation, where there was a war, when the Grand National Assembly was employing these kinds of terminologies, they were fighting against the enemy. There was a war. They had an army under their command, fighting for the liberation of the land from occupation. With that gone, we should understand that the Grand National Assembly is the institutional representation of the nation, but that's as far as it goes. We don't have to have any more argument than that. The most we can do is to adopt the principle of legislative supremacy into the Constitution and argue that legislature is the supreme institution of the state, which is fount of all legitimacy. All laws are made by the Grand National Assembly, and Grand National Assembly has the power to speak in the name of the people, all of it, at any point in time. And that can be adopted as a major legislative principle. And this has been practiced by some democracies. The best example is the Westminster model of democracy in Britain, which didn't even have a written constitution because they don't need to write one when you assume that the legislature is the people or the nation. It can then act as the nation on all matters, constitutional or otherwise, and you don't need to have written down rules to follow under those circumstances. You have a group of people who decide what needs to be done, what needs to be decided at any point in time, and there is no problem with that. So in the Turkish case, Westminster model was a basic inspiration, especially after 1924, when Turkey had its first normal constitution after the War of Liberation. And in fact, the principle of legislative supremacy was inscribed into that constitution. And it has been repeated in the 1961 and 1982 constitutions. Even today, that principle still exists. But using it, you have to be very careful if you would like to stay within the confines of democratic rule. You should be very careful in not using it against the opposition, which is as legitimate as the government in any democratic form of government. So, legislative supremacy became the pillar of the regime and a fundamental principle of the Constitution of the country from 1924 onwards. And we will go back to that. Now, the nationalists, since they negated any kind of occupation, they also negated any kind of imperialistic hegemony, domination under any guise. So the basic principle that they would like to enshrine was the principle of independence, political and economic independence. In Lausanne and in the treaties they negotiated afterwards, they were keen on establishing these principles. They pushed very hard for ending the capitulations, which the Ottomans had given out from the 16th century onwards, starting with small states and eventually giving various privileges in trade relations to many states. Those were all discarded. You may be able to find it on the internet. Before he died, İnönü, in the 1970s, was interviewed on the Turkish radio and television, and he narrated his negotiations during the Lausanne Treaty with Lord Curzon of Britain. And it was a big, big principle on which he argued. And the negotiations was broken down on this issue of capitulations and the Ottoman debt. And he argued that Curzon told him that İnönü was insistently refusing to accept all of these economic privileges extended to these various European states. But Curzon argued, according to this interview to İnönü, that once Turkish Republic is established, it will be in need of improvement of its status. How is that going to be done? He said, you will come back to me and ask for economic debt. Then he said, I will take this out of my pocket and put it in front of you and ask you to accept whatever you refused here. That left, again, another indelible mark in the minds of these people who ruled Turkey for a while, especially İnönü. He never applied for any debt, period. And when the Democrat Party government did so, they were livid with criticism that they are opening the road to another colonial practice that we had suffered so much under in the ancien regime of the Ottomans, and this could not be accepted under any circumstances as a benign economic design. Eventually, we will lose our control over the economy and our own lives, and we will become servile to those who extend us this debt eventually. And the debt issue became a burning issue after that in Turkish politics from 1950s up until now, and still continues. This year, Turkey is paying $164 billion of debt to the loaners in 2014. It's still with us, and will stay with us for a long time to come, because Turkey has, as we will see in greater detail, a chronic trade deficit with international markets, which it cannot bridge and turn into a balanced trade or a trade with an export surplus. Consequently, we have to get loans, and those loans have to be paid back. And that is, of course, an additional burden on Turkish governments any time into the foreseeable future as well. Due to this sensitivity to economic and political independence, he insisted that the straits should be left in the Turkish hands, which was an issue which lingered on until 1936, in which a treaty was signed in the city of Montreux, which defines the status of the two straits, Dardanelles and Bosphorus, connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean, and finally provided Turkish sovereignty over the straits by reference to an international treaty. The negotiations broke down. The Turkish representatives were hauled back to Ankara, and then they continued on again. And after finally accepting the borders, the debt of the Ottomans, accepting the end to capitulations, accepting the Turkish sovereignty over the territory, including the seas, the treaty could now be signed between Turkey and the participating victorious powers of the First World War, which repealed the Treaty of Sèvres and established the Treaty of Lausanne. The status of the Aegean Islands was determined in favor of Greece and also the Italians at the time. Then, as I told you, the Dodecanese, those 12 islands on the southwestern corner of Turkey, were left to the Greeks after the Second World War, when the Italians and the Greeks participated in that war on different sides, and the Italians lost the war, as you very well know, at the end of the Second World War. Now, the issues pertaining to the independence of the country following an independent political and economic course has been an integral part of the domestic debate and also foreign relations of the country since the very beginning. And finally, the Islamist movement, those who were using Islam for political reasons and mobilizing the masses, by using Islamic symbols, slogans, Islamic phrases, insignia, etc., were considered as traitors. And they were considered as a potential for agitation by colonial powers to undermine the newly established republic, which had been experiencing severe difficulties with running up its own economy, managing its own affairs under the circumstances because of this, the cost of war that incurred upon the Turkish state as a result of all these developments. But it became clear after the 24th of July 1923 that the Ottomans were gone. Resuscitating the Ottoman Empire would not be attractive, especially for Mustafa Kemal himself, who had emerged as a charismatic leader. For he seemed to have done something unbelievably difficult. For the Ottoman forces had been defeated by the British resoundingly during the First World War. So how could this dilapidated state of affairs rendered it possible for a military challenge to this kind of an awesome empire under the circumstances possible? Just to give you an understanding of how people were influenced by Mustafa Kemal's leadership under that time, I give you this experience of a journalist called Refi Jawad Ulunay, who wrote until the 1960s or early 70s when he died at Milliyet newspaper. He was one of those 150 journalists who was sent out of the country, extradited for their anti-regime activities for a while. He was a young man looking for a story. And in 1919 spring, he discovered that this young general, Mustafa Kemal, was in his home in Shishli, which is now a museum, and you can go and visit it if you want to at your leisure time, in Shishli. Visited this man when Istanbul was under occupation. The British, French, Italian warships were just anchored in the Bosphorus. He talked to him, I think more than a day, interviewed him with the intent of publishing this interview. He came back to his newspaper, and the editor-in-chief called him. He said, "Where have you been?" He said, "I've been to Mustafa Kemal interviewing him." He said, "What have you found?" He said, "The man is utterly crazy," he said. "He told me such things that I can't write. If I write it, you will also think that I am crazy as well." And decided not to publish anything that he said. Perhaps fortunately for Kemal, because it looked as if, from the narrative of Ulunay himself, it seemed as if Mustafa Kemal told him exactly what he intended to do after he left Istanbul on the 15th of May. Had he published that, I don't know what would have happened. He hadn't. He couldn't. He didn't believe in it. When he told tidbits about the interview to the editor-in-chief, he said, "You're right. This man is crazy." The odds were so great that what was accomplished was unbelievable. And Latife Hanım, the first lady of the Turkish Republic, married Mustafa Kemal early on and then had a divorce, gave one interview in which she argued that the miracle of it was that he was able to lead a ragtag army with few broken rifles and was able to defeat very well endowed armies supported by the British, which was totally unexpected. He was a good strategist, well educated, and he knew his limits. He knew the limits of the military, of the army, and the men he employed. And he seemed to have actually delivered something that looked like very high odds. It was one of the first war of liberations of the 20th century, right after the First World War, it also ignited many others. Had a role to play, heartening, for example, the Indians to resist against the British after they discovered that the British was not able to impose their will upon the Turks in Anatolia, or the Turkish nationalists in Anatolia, under those circumstances. But under these circumstances, the domestic forces, which he grappled with, seem to have given this impression to him and those who followed his line that they're, domestically speaking, the most important problem that they had to fix was with the challenge of the Islamists, who were ready to compromise anything to come to power and rule, and ready to sell their soul to the occupying forces, devil in the eyes of the nationalists. So they became the big enemies of the nationalists, which they thought should have been dealt with. Now, in this process, the new nationalist regime defined their ambition and the vision, and also their vision, by relevance to civilization. Their understanding of civilization was formulated by a nationalist sociologist, Ziya Gökalp, who was highly influential at the turn of the century among Turkish nationalists. And he was deeply influenced by Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist. More or less adopted Émile Durkheim's thinking into the context in which he operated. Ziya Gökalp argued that civilization and culture are two completely different phenomena. At any point in time, he argued, that there can be only one single civilization on earth. There cannot be several civilizations. You can't have an Eastern and a Western civilization living side by side. Perhaps much longer in the past, when they had not interacted and had their own spheres of existence, that could have happened, but no longer. There is one single civilization, though there may be many cultures. Within that civilization, also outside of it. So he argued that the civilization of the late 19th, early 20th century was geographically located in Europe. And the European civilization, as I narrated through the eyes of Ziya Pasha, has produced a lot of fruits with success to humanity. So we have to orient ourselves to that civilization and become a part of it. And whatever was inhibiting us from getting involved in that kind of civilization and participating in it should be eliminated as much as possible. The nationalists considered the Islamist movement as one of the most important factors undermining Turkish potential for orientation towards and walk to civilization and participation in it, and tried to deal with them along those lines as such. So they saw cultural reform and reconstruction as a fundamental precondition of peace and development in the country. And that is why they moved to religious symbols and lifestyles and tried to recreate a new understanding in the symbols that constitute political culture of the country as such. And this is nothing, again, new. As I told you earlier, in 1825, 100 years ago, Mahmud II, when he was starting the reforms, had already started at the same location. But the Republican nationalist governments went a little further, because they had no major hindrances, no janissaries to rise up against them, no people who could effectively support a traditional conservative agenda any longer, because 90% of the population lived in villages, not well connected, with very little social capital, very little resources at their disposal. They didn't know how to read and write. First census after the Republic indicated that 11% of the population knew how to read and write. 11%. And that probably was an exaggeration. That turned out to be an advantage of reforming a lot of things. And they were peasants and nomads. Therefore, they were not in no position to organize effectively to withstand against the reforms of the central government, in any sense of the term. And the 10% who lived in the urban areas believed in the same kind of orientation mostly as the government. The better educated urban elite considered themselves part of the center, had oriented themselves towards supporting the charisma of Mustafa Kemal and his associates, and were ready to follow the route that they were tracking. So under those circumstances, there was no major countervailing power that could withstand these steps to be taken by the nationalists. Some, of course, were not, and the majority was not necessarily influenced by any of this. When Atatürk introduced the hat, which was referred to in his jargon, Şemsiperli Serpuş, which is a terminology we don't use in Turkish any longer, as we very well know, which means that it had a sort of shadow-creating extension to the hat. And when he introduced the hat, this was intended for headwear of men in the urban areas, so about 5% of the population. The peasants, men, the few who were left behind after the war, did not necessarily wear a hat or a fez. Fez was an urban headwear. It was not a rural headwear. The religious officials wore the turban, fine. They could continue on doing so, according to the new legislation, during the practice of their services, in the mosque or in the graveyard, funeral home, whatever, but not necessarily anywhere else. Not during regular daily sojourns, running errands in the urban environment in which they lived, or the rural environment for that matter. But it was the rest of the population, mostly the bureaucrats. In fact, the law instituted that they wear this hat all the time, even indoors, when they were sitting in their offices, because they were afraid that they would take out this hat and put the fez back once they're in their offices. So to sever all that tie, it was imposed upon them that they'll be wearing, instead of the fez, the hat, as they were wearing the fez all the time, indoors, outdoors. Period. The most important of these reforms came a little later in the 1930s, after the major legal changes occurred in the 1920s, which you could also consider as part of the cultural reforms, but they were more legal, constitutional than cultural in essence. The most important change came with the 1926 reform of the Civil Code. This time, the nationalist government imported wholesale the Swiss Civil Code, which was formulated a few years earlier, pretty modern. So Swiss Civil Code became Medeni Kanun. More or less it was a translation. Now you'll hear and see and read in various places that it was the Minister of Justice, Mahmud Esat Bozkurt, who had received his degree from Switzerland in law, actually was involved in the translation of this. The man had developed some fascistic ideas, etc., and the Swiss code was most amenable to this, etc. All sorts of argumentation is continuing. But the most important thing they did was to move into an area which the Ottomans were not able to legislate or codify that easily. They had changed the earlier Sharia practice and had introduced something called Mejelle, which was abolished afterwards. And in its place came the Madani Qanun in 1926, which provided, first of all, basis for further secularization, removed all of these matters of inheritance, marriage, divorce, personal status out of the control of the religious qadi. In the introduction, which is written by Mahmud Esat Bozkurt, you will find the basis of the argument for secularization at the time, or laïcité, laiklik at the time. He argued that by changing this law and implementing it, there will be a single standard applicable to the entire society, as opposed to the previous practice of different judges making different decisions for the same or very similar cases in different parts of the country. He argued that there are, in some cases, 300 different decisions made on the same issue, same problem, approached by different judges or jurisprudents from different perspectives of religion and what have you. So all of that is gone. Now it created for civil marriage. And in fact, legalized civil marriage as the only kind of marriage that is legally, officially acceptable, providing rights for the first time to women. Now this is an important move, but you should also take into consideration the piece of information I have already communicated to you. Many able-bodied, relatively young men died in this period due to war, due to various epidemics, typhoid, dysentery, etc. In the war, people do not usually die of bombs and bullets, etc. They die out of epidemics, dirt. Battlegrounds are awful places. If you read about them, there's nothing heroic about it. They are filled with filth, smells awful, because rotting bodies smell awful. And not all the time you can collect them. And it's a sort of where the humanity ebbs to a nadir, where human life becomes negotiable, dispensable. It's a despicable situation to find yourself in. Most who fought, after they have written what they have went through, do not necessarily narrate stories of heroism. They narrate stories about how they were able to keep their body intact when they are surrounded by their comrades who died of dysentery or cholera or typhoid. Lice explode and carry diseases. And many people die of them under those circumstances. So this left behind an overwhelming number of women. And women became an integral part of the labor force. Suddenly their importance increased in the economy and also in the society. So the Republic recognized this role that these people played and provided some additional rights to women. And the Civil Code provided women with rights that they had not enjoyed under Mejelle. It was very easy for men to divorce women, number one, and also polygamy was practiced, which now became outlawed. Monogamy is the only basic acceptable official way of getting married and establishing families. So when we talk about family now, after 1926, it's the nuclear family. We're not talking about 4 wives. Mind you that a man could easily get rid of a wife by declaring that that wife and himself is no longer bound together 3 times, send the wife back to her family, and could remarry another lady if there is an eligible bride-to-be. So it's not restricted to 4 wives in one's lifetime. It could be as many as one can afford. Yes, there are, religiously speaking, certain standards, but who cares whether those standards were implemented or not? So under these circumstances, the status of women was terribly low. So the change in this picture provided the opportunity for the Republic to engage the women, uplift their status, and protect them with certain rights that they had not enjoyed earlier. Besides, now, by default, women became the head of households in this land. For men perished, or they came back debilitated, limbs missing, lost an arm, a leg, what have you. Not only the dead, but also the injured created a depletion of the labor force. So civil law was the most important and most critical movement in 1926 for the establishment of something like that. In 1928, the Constitution was amended 2 years after this law was accepted to take out the article which declared that the state religion was Islam. Religion of the state is Islam. That is taken out in 1928. The term laiklik, the equivalent of laicite in Turkish, crept into the Constitution in 1937, but not before. So it's a major process. Now in this time, the most important change that occurred was with the letters and numerals, which were switched from Arabic to Latin. Now again, that looked like a daunting task. It wasn't so difficult. Why? Because very few sliver of the population knew how to read and write anyway. When you don't know how to read and write, whether the script is in Chinese, Sanskrit, Mayan, or Arabic makes a little difference. You don't understand it. You don't know how to read and write. Once literacy becomes part and parcel of your life, then changing the script becomes an important phenomenon. So only with about 10% of the population literate, it wasn't that difficult to make the change. Secondly, most of these students in the secondary schools were getting instruction in French also. Remember the French as the dominant foreign language being used in the Ottoman Empire? Well, it crept onto the Republican era. So they already thoroughly knew the Roman alphabet. And they were writing with Roman alphabet in French classes. So it was not a big shift so far as these people were concerned. It was assumed that such a shift would make it easier for large swaths of the population to learn how to read and write very easily. Well, the record doesn't seem to indicate that there was a stellar success with that. Still, we have a literacy rate in the 90s. Up until the end of the 20th century, only about 85% or so of the population knew how to read and write. And most of them not very effectively, to tell you the truth. I haven't seen in any census when you're asked, do you know how to read and write? And somebody responds, yes. The census takers putting a newspaper and say, read that, if possible. I wonder what percentage would be able to do so. My hunch is that many people are not effective in reading and writing still. Even today, we seem to have a problem with that ability to read and write, which is not necessarily something that has to do with the script per se, probably. only with a script per se, probably. The Ottomans had tried throughout the 19th century to change the alphabet. Enver Pasha, before the Republican era, had produced a simpler form of the alphabet. Again, using Arabic letters, but changing them to conform to the requirements of Turkish as a language. There have been many attempts at that. The Republic was able to move in this direction because there were no countervailing forces holding them back, and therefore they were able to introduce an alphabet reform. Change the calendar also to Gregorian calendar to become part of this civilization with greater ease. And also moved the Sabbath from Friday to Sunday to sort of make it parallel with European countries and make our interactions easier under those circumstances. And then there were many attempts at instituting official institutions to reform the language and also produce research and writing on history, which by some also led to some kind of attempts at creating an official history where there would be something of a favorable picture of the Turkish past, especially remote Turkish past, be integrated. Now, these institutions of language and history has produced various fruits, products in the form of lexicons, dictionaries, which are now accessible on the web, and also publications on history works, etc., as such. In this process, by the 1930s, there had been some changes towards a form of racist ethnic nationalism again, which was more inspired by Italy and Germany, where larger number of students were sent for education in the interwar period. Also some to the Soviet Union, especially engineers. So it looked as if these countries, none of them were ruled democratically, became models to be replicated for rapid economic growth and economic independence. And these people who ruled Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union, that is Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin, became favorably viewed by the political elites of the Republican era of the 1930s because they were able to create almost miraculous economic growth in these countries. And some efforts of replicating the same in Turkey were carried out, which by the end of the Second World War was completely dropped, and Turkey moved rather peacefully towards a multi-party democratic format of government in 1945 by the decision of the Republican People's Party. It's one of the few non-violent moves out of authoritarian regimes in the world, and a major accomplishment. But a form of democratic government we've had difficulty establishing and running ever since then. But the foreign relations in this period was deeply influenced by the conditions of Lausanne and what Turkey inherited then, which I already talked to you about. For Turkey is connected to three different regions or theaters of the international political system: Middle East, Caucasus, Balkans. All of them are volatile. Look at the last decade, or 2 decades, 3 decades back. You'll see that there's a lot of conflict simmering exploding all around Turkey. But previously, there were also big countries, big powers, controlling these territories on the other side of the border with Turkey. For a while, Turkey even became neighbors with the United States when the US invaded Iraq. From 2003 until they pulled out a few years ago. So, from time to time, we come into close contact with very powerful armies and forces, and therefore preserving the rights and status gained on the 24th of July 1923 became a major aspect of conducting foreign policy, which had been severely attacked, especially by the Islamist movement and then by the conservative political party that came to power in Turkey. They tried to change it, and the outcome is a disaster. We're now facing a mess without necessarily conducting a foreign policy of any sort towards the South. In 2013, one of the major figures in this government in charge of conducting foreign relations of Turkey declared that the Turkish foreign policy towards the Middle East is değerli yalnızlık, valuable loneliness. I don't know whether this is meant to be a foreign policy, but as far as I know, in this world of ours, nobody does survive alone, not even the United States. You have to have interdependencies, coalitions, and expect to sort of form some kind of solidarities to be able to use your resources to deter your enemies and to somehow manage the hostilities towards you. So it looks as if this kind of policy is a sensible kind of policy. The slogan behind that, peace at home, peace abroad, has now been again reintroduced into the web page of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Turkish government, MFA.gov.tr. If you go into that website, and you'll see that they are enshrining that slogan all over again. For it looks as if alternative foreign policy creates nothing but mess so far. It looks as if this is a sensible way of operating under these circumstances. For much can come into peril, and the stakes could be very high if Turkey decides to become revisionist and adventurous in its foreign relations with the neighbors. For it looks as if there are very powerful other, should I say, major armies, states in operation in our environs. Just to our south, for example, Russia and Iran are two major forces that you have to take into consideration if you have any idea of getting involved more deeply into the affairs of either Syrian or Iraqi politics today. You have to have some way of containing these two. And alone, you can't manage it. So the government is discovering even today. So this policy was a sensible policy that has been followed and that kept Turkey relatively secure and peaceful in a very, very turbulent environment for a very long time. And we were able also to settle some disputes through peace and diplomacy, both in the case of Mosul, not to our advantage, and in the case of Alexandretta, to a certain extent our advantage, but without convincing the Syrians that Alexandretta should belong to Turkey, not to Syria. So if you watch the Syrian television, even today, they show that area as part of Syria and give weather forecasts, etc., about Sancak of Alexandretta, although it's officially, legally, part of Turkey, where some who fled from the fighting in Syria also had taken refuge in that part of the land. That issue was settled before Mustafa Kemal himself died in 1938, but officially Turkish troops entered Alexandretta as the French troops moved out of it, French mandate, in 1939, right before the Second World War. The Syrians consider this as sort of a gesture made by the French and the British at the beginning of the Second World War to create a good impression on Turkey, not to side with Italy and Germany in the war, as they had done in the First World War, which they thought would be not to the advantage of Britain and France. Turkey kept a neutral position in the war, stayed out of the war. It was sort of pressured to enter the war twice, once in Adana, in another case in Cairo, by Sir Winston Churchill, who talked to İsmet İnönü at length. İnönü argued that Turkey didn't have the manpower or the necessary military equipment to fight the German troops. So ask for these. You know, so many battleships, so many warplanes, so many tanks. And Churchill said, are you kidding me? You know, we're in a very difficult situation right now. We can't do anything of the sort. Said, without them, we won't be taking part in the war. So by the end of the war, it looked as if Turkey again found itself not only neutral, but relatively alone. And therefore, on that kind of development, it began to be further threatened by some kind of Soviet demands on it. But at the same time, it was at that time calculated that declaring war on Germany would not be too bad an idea by February 1945. And they were pretty much defeated by that time anyway. And Turkey finally participated in the war in February 1945, which did not save Turkey from a lot of criticism at the end of the war. But when Stalin pressured Turkey to deploy Red Army troops on both sides of the straits to protect Turkey, also Russia, from foreign threat, and also changing the border between Turkey and Georgia in a way to provide for Georgians more territory. Turkey resisted the idea, and that was one of the main reasons why Turkey started to seek closer relationship with the Club of Democracies and moved very fast in the direction of establishing a multi-party democratic regime, went for multi-party elections in 1946 in a very short period of time. But emerged out of this mess without losing any territory. And therefore, you could argue that the policies have been quite successful as such. And throughout this period, the War of Liberation created in the minds of these people that they needed more economic resources very fast. Improve the welfare, socio-economic welfare of people living in Eastern Thrace and Anatolia as quickly as possible. That has now become one of the major goals of every Turkish government. So creating economic development, rapid economic development, and creating conditions for improved economic welfare and also social benefits to a larger group of people and provide them with more social welfare have now become one of the major goals. So at the very beginning in 1923, a conference was held in Izmir to establish a road to economic growth and look into ways of dealing with these problems. Many suggested several different ideas, but originally the Turkish government decided to go along with the market forces, a relatively liberal approach to economic growth. However, in a very short period of time, they came into enormous amount of difficulty with the start of Great Depression in 1929. They lost their trust or confidence in the markets and move towards a more state-oriented, public enterprise-oriented approach, which we call devletçilik, which may be translated into a foreign language as etatism or statism as a policy as such. In this process of the markets, the Republican nationalist governments tried to create a middle class of entrepreneurs from the new population of Turkey, which was overwhelmingly Muslim. And they increasingly encouraged more and more Muslims to take part in economic growth and become involved in economic entrepreneurship, which eventually led to interesting developments, created different and difficult circumstances for Levanten, those who came from Europe and settled here and worked in the economy, and also from non-Muslims as such. There has been a sort of an Islamization of the Turkish middle class. I don't know whether this is a correct terminology to be used, but they tried to create a business community that would feel at home in this homeland and would be more loyal to this homeland and would be ready to invest in this homeland rather than earn some money and then transfer the profits abroad. And this policy seemed to have led to some form of economic nationalism under these circumstances. And this created a potential for increasing inclusivity of Anatolian entrepreneurs, first in the 1930s, but later in 1940s, mainly through the war, boosted again after 1950s, and of course more closely after 1980s, which seemed to have been an influential process so far as the economy is concerned, and we'll track down and follow this trajectory of economic change later on in this course, which is going to be the topic in the closing week, close to closing week of this semester. Okay, we have a recess next week.